Alexander Graham Bell was far more than the inventor of the telephone. He was a visionary scientist, educator, and humanitarian whose passion for sound and communication changed the world. Born into a family deeply involved in speech and elocution, Bell dedicated his life to helping the deaf and exploring the possibilities of transmitting voice across great distances. His groundbreaking inventions laid the foundation for modern communication, but his legacy also includes tireless work in education and scientific research. Join us as we explore Bell's remarkable journey. Chapter 1: Early Life and Family Background in Scotland. A voice born in Edinburgh. In the heart of Edinburgh, Scotland, a city steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, cobblestone alleys, and the sounds of Scottish song, Alexander Graham Bell was born on the 3rd of March, 1847. His birth occurred at 16 South Charlotte Street, a modest yet respectable stone-built residence near the city's Grand Princes Street. The Bell family was no stranger to sound. They were immersed in the intricacies of language, voice, and the art of communication. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was a prominent elocutionist and phonetician, known for his deep involvement in developing a system to help the deaf communicate, visible speech. His grandfather, Alexander Bell, was also a respected elocutionist and teacher of speech. His mother, Eliza Grace Simons Bell, was a quietly brilliant woman with an artistic soul and a remarkable influence on young Alec's sensitivity and intellect despite gradually losing her hearing. Young Alexander, known to friends and family as Alec, was the second of 3 sons, nestled between Melville James Bell and Edward Charles Bell. From an early age, Alec showed signs of both mischief and genius. He was curious, inventive, and surprisingly empathetic for a boy raised in a Victorian academic household. His sensitivity likely stemmed from his mother's hearing loss. Alec developed the habit of speaking close to her forehead so she could feel the vibrations of his voice. This early exposure to the world of the deaf shaped his life's work. A childhood of curiosity. Alec's mind was like a sponge, and his earliest years were filled with questions. By the age of 10, he had already built a rudimentary speaking machine using a reed, a bellows, and other parts scavenged from household items. The machine mimicked simple vowel sounds, an early foreshadowing of his interest in both sound mechanics and speech. He was not a disciplined student, often distracted by his private experiments and mechanical tinkering. Nevertheless, he was a voracious reader and particularly fond of scientific texts. His father, recognizing this gift, began to mentor him personally in elocution and phonetics. The family would often host impromptu lessons in sound articulation, with the boys asked to replicate complicated sounds or interpret abstract phonetic symbols. It was an unusual childhood, to say the least, but it was one that laid the foundation for his inventive genius. Tragedy and transition. Alec's teenage years were not without sorrow. The Bell family was struck by tragedy when both of his brothers succumbed to tuberculosis, a rampant and deadly disease of the time. First, Edward died in 1867. Then, in 1870, Melville followed. The heartbreak was overwhelming, and the emotional toll, especially on their father, was heavy. Alexander Melville Bell, worried that his remaining son might also fall victim to the disease, made a life-changing decision. The family would leave Scotland for the cleaner air and new beginnings of Canada. And so, in July 1870, the Bells set sail for the New World. From Edinburgh to Brantford. The family eventually settled in Brantford, Ontario, on a 10-acre homestead they called Melville House. The property overlooked the Grand River and featured a white clapboard house nestled among apple trees, rolling fields, and woodland. The move was rejuvenating. For Alec, the open Canadian countryside was a wonderland of experimentation. He built a working model of a human skull, complete with artificial vocal cords. He experimented with electricity and telegraphy. He even created a voice transmission wire across the property, a primitive precursor to what would become his most famous invention. But Canada was not merely a place of healing, it was also a place of transition. In 1871, Alexander received an offer that would permanently change the course of his life: to move to Boston, Massachusetts, and teach at the Boston School for the Deaf. He accepted, and with that, Alexander Graham Bell stepped into the world where invention would meet destiny. Chapter 2: Migration to the United States and Early Teaching Career. A New Beginning in America. In 1871, at just 24 years old, Alexander Graham Bell left the serenity of Brantford, Ontario, and embarked on a journey that would bring his life's purpose into sharper focus. Armed with a letter of recommendation and his father's revolutionary system of visible speech, he made his way to Boston, Massachusetts, a city buzzing with intellectual energy, innovation, and reform. Bell had been invited to train teachers and work directly with students at the Boston School for the Deaf, thanks to the advocacy of Gardner Green Hubbard, a wealthy Boston lawyer and education reformer. It was Hubbard's daughter Mabel who would later become Bell's wife, but their first connection was academic, not romantic. In Boston, Bell quickly became a beloved instructor. He stood apart from other teachers because he didn't see the deaf as broken or deficient. He saw them as individuals with untapped potential. Using gestures, vibrations, and facial expressions, he taught them how to see sound, echoing what he had learned from helping his own mother. His empathy was authentic. He wasn't teaching from a place of pity, but of genuine understanding. Within just a few months, Bell's work earned the attention of Horace Mann's School for the Deaf and Clark's School for the Deaf. He began receiving offers to consult and teach in multiple cities. Though he lacked formal university credentials, his knowledge of acoustics, phonetics, and education was undeniable. The Hubbard family. Around this time, Bell was introduced more formally to Mabel Hubbard, the intelligent and spirited daughter of his benefactor. Mabel had lost her hearing at the age of 5 due to scarlet fever, but she was bright, curious, and determined not to let her condition define her. Bell began tutoring Mabel privately, but their sessions soon turned into something deeper. They shared a fascination with language, sound, and the mysteries of the human mind. Though Bell was nearly a decade older and still financially unstable, the bond between them grew steadily. Mabel was not only beautiful but intellectually vibrant and unlike anyone Bell had ever met. He once wrote in a letter to a friend, "She is the sunshine of my life. Every time I see her, I feel I must create something new, something worthy of her brilliance." Their connection would inspire not only love, but the greatest invention of Bell's life, an obsession with sound. Bell's evenings were often spent alone in his modest boarding house, surrounded by wires, metal rods, and diaphragms. He was consumed by a radical idea. What if human voice, the most complex of sounds, could be transmitted over wires, the same way telegraph pulses were? Others had attempted this before, including Elisha Gray, but Bell's approach was different. He theorized that a variable electric current could carry the waveform of spoken words, not just pulses or clicks. This wasn't merely about encoding a message, it was about capturing the living sound of the human voice itself. By 1873, Bell had become a professor of vocal physiology and elocution at Boston University, giving him more time and freedom to pursue his acoustic experiments. It was here that he met Thomas Watson, a young and capable electrical technician who would soon become Bell's most important collaborator. Watson was a brilliant tinkerer. Where Bell had vision and theory, Watson had the hands-on skill to bring it to life. The race toward invention. In a dusty workshop on Court Street, Bell and Watson began building experimental transmitters and receivers. They sketched diagrams of vibrating diaphragms, explored electromagnetic induction, and argued over circuits late into the night. In 1875, their experiments began to yield promising results. During one session, Watson plucked a metal reed, and Bell, on the receiving end of the device, heard a faint vibration. It wasn't clear speech, but it was something alive. This moment validated Bell's theory. Speech could be transformed into electrical signals and transmitted across wires. But time was running out. Elisha Gray, a well-respected inventor, had filed a similar idea for transmitting speech electronically. Bell had to act fast. On the 14th of February, 1876, Bell's lawyer filed a patent for the invention that would be called the telephone. Gray filed his own paperwork just hours later. What followed was one of the most hotly contested patent disputes in American history. But Bell's claim was recorded first, and it would change the world. The first words ever transmitted. On the 10th of March, 1876, the breakthrough came. Bell, working on a transmitter, spilled acid on his clothes. He called out, without thinking, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Watson, seated in the next room, heard the words clearly through the receiver. It was the first successful transmission of human speech over an electric wire. History had just been made not in a grand laboratory or a polished university, but in a cluttered attic workshop by two dreamers powered by obsession, heartbreak, and hope. Chapter 3. Love, Marriage, and the Birth of the Bell Telephone Company. A new era of sound? The year 1876 marked the dawn of a new age. Alexander Graham Bell had done what was once deemed impossible. He had sent the human voice across wires. The successful test with Thomas Watson was no mere experiment. It was the first spark of a communications revolution. But even as Bell basked in the excitement, he knew this invention would mean little without protection, promotion, and production. The U.S. Patent Office granted Bell Patent Number 174,465 on the 7th of March, 1876, for the invention of an improvement in telegraphy, a name that would later be widely recognized as the telephone. That single document would become one of the most valuable patents in history. But the road ahead was not smooth. Bell's invention sparked fierce competition and skepticism. Many scientists dismissed it as a parlor trick. Even the press scoffed. Yet Bell, now emboldened, continued refining the telephone. He demonstrated the device at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in June 1876, where it captivated none other than Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil and Sir William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin. From that moment, the world began to pay attention. Mabel, the voice he loved most. While Bell's professional life was accelerating, so too was his personal life. His affection for Mabel Hubbard had deepened, as had hers for him. Their bond was no longer just intellectual, it was romantic, intimate, and passionate. Mabel was everything Bell was not: wealthy, socially poised, and connected to Boston's elite. She had been raised to speak and write fluently despite her deafness. She admired Bell's idealism, his brilliance, and most of all, his unwavering kindness toward her. Bell, meanwhile, adored her determination. In Mabel he saw strength and grace that mirrored his own mother. He often wrote to her with poetic devotion, "You are my inspiration, my compass, and the warmth that quiets all doubts." Despite her parents' initial concern about Bell's financial instability, Mabel stood firm in her desire to marry him. On the 11th of July, 1877, Alexander Graham Bell and Mabel Hubbard were married at her family's estate in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As a wedding gift, Bell gave Mabel all the shares in the newly formed Bell Telephone Company, an act of trust and love that would soon make her one of the wealthiest women in America. The birth of the Bell Telephone Company. Only days before their wedding, the Bell Telephone Company was officially established on the 9th of July, 1877, with backing from Gardner Green Hubbard and Thomas Sanders. Bell, still more of a scientist than a businessman, took little interest in day-to-day management. He left the operations to others while he continued experimenting with new improvements to the telephone. Yet his name was now synonymous with innovation. Bell's original telephone was crude, a membrane, a coil, and a magnet. But even in its simplicity, it revolutionized communication. No longer were people constrained by distance, waiting for mail or Morse code. Now, with a telephone, they could speak to each other in real time, even across cities. The first telephone exchange opened in New Haven, Connecticut in 1878, and shortly thereafter, the first long-distance line connected Boston and Somerville. The Bell Telephone Company quickly licensed telephone equipment to entrepreneurs across America. By 1880, there were more than 30,000 telephones in operation. The company had become the nucleus of what would later become AT&T, one of the most powerful corporations in the world. The court battles begin, but with success came conflict. Inventors and companies rushed to claim pieces of the new communications frontier. Bell faced over 600 lawsuits challenging his patent, including from Western Union, the dominant force in telegraphy. Their attorneys declared Bell's patent invalid and accused him of stealing ideas from Elisha Gray. Bell, though reluctant, was forced to defend his claim. The legal proceedings were arduous, but ultimately every court upheld his patent rights. In 1887, the Supreme Court ruled in Bell's favor, securing his legacy and the company's dominance. Throughout the battles, Bell remained philosophical. He was never motivated by money, but by the thrill of discovery. He once said, "The inventor looks upon the world and is not content with it. He wants to improve it. Love, letters, and a growing family." During this whirlwind of invention and litigation, Bell and Mabel settled into married life. Despite their wealth, they were not ostentatious. They shared a deep intellectual connection and often exchanged long letters when separated by travel. Mabel gave birth to 4 children, 2 daughters, Elsie Mae and Marion Daisy, and 2 sons who tragically died in infancy. The loss of their sons was a quiet sorrow they carried throughout their lives. Despite his success, Bell never stopped being a teacher. He worked tirelessly on methods to educate the deaf, advocating for oralism, the teaching of speech, and lip reading rather than sign language. Though controversial today, at the time, Bell believed this would give the deaf better integration into society. He supported schools for the deaf-trained teachers and corresponded with educators around the world. He even worked with the famous deaf-blind author Helen Keller, helping her find her voice both literally and metaphorically. Chapter 4. Scientific Pursuits Beyond the Telephone Flight, Sound, and Innovation. The Inventor Unbound. With the telephone firmly established and the Bell Telephone Company rapidly expanding, Alexander Graham Bell found himself at a rare juncture. Unlike many inventors who become imprisoned by their own success, Bell used his newfound wealth and influence to explore new frontiers. By the 1882nd, Bell had largely stepped away from the commercial operations of his company. His heart remained in science and invention. While others ran the business, he returned to his laboratory, his sanctuary. To Bell, invention was never about profit. It was about curiosity, the joy of discovery, and the betterment of humanity. Volta Laboratory, a sanctuary for innovation. In 1880, Bell received the prestigious Volta Prize from the French government for his work on the telephone. With the accompanying 50,000 francs, he established the Volta Laboratory in Washington, D.C., along with his trusted collaborators, Chichester Bell, his cousin, and Charles Sumner Tainter. Their mission: to explore sound, hearing, and recording technologies. One of their earliest innovations was the graphophone, a significant improvement on Thomas Edison's phonograph. Whereas Edison's device used tinfoil, the graphophone utilized wax-coated cylinders and could reproduce sound more clearly and reliably. This invention laid the groundwork for the recording industry. Bell and his partners later licensed their innovations, leading to the formation of the Columbia Phonograph Company. The Volta Laboratory also explored early forms of magnetic recording, sound analysis, and even audiology. Bell was fascinated by the human ear and once attempted to create a mechanical model of it. He believed that understanding biology was essential to improving technology, a philosophy that remains relevant today. A home in Baddeck, Bell's Canadian retreat. Despite his international acclaim, Bell remained emotionally tied to Canada, the country that had given his family refuge and healing. In 1885, the Bell family visited the small village of Baddeck, located on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia. Enchanted by the pristine lakes, fresh air, and friendly people, Bell purchased land there and built a large estate called Bean Brae, meaning beautiful mountain in Scottish Gaelic. It became more than a vacation home. It became his personal research hub. There, in a converted stable and lab near the shore of Brodor Lake, Bell conducted experiments in marine engineering, aviation, and alternative fuels. He loved the quietude, the natural beauty, and the freedom to create without distraction. Bean Brae was where Bell, now in his 50s, would do some of his boldest work. Flight and the Aerial Experiment Association. In the early 1902, Bell became captivated by the idea of human flight. Though the Wright brothers had achieved controlled flight in 1903, Bell believed there was much more to be done, and he wanted to be part of it. In 1907, he founded the Aerial Experiment Association, AEA, along with 5 other enthusiasts, including Glenn Curtiss, who would become a pioneer in aviation. Funded by Mabel Bell, the AEA set up operations at Bean Brae and began constructing experimental flying machines. Among their achievements, the Red Wing and White Wing gliders, the June Bug, which won the Scientific American Trophy for flying over 1 kilometer, the Silver Dart, which made the first powered flight in Canada in 1909. Though Bell did not fly himself, his mathematical insights and knowledge of aerodynamics guided the group's progress. He was especially interested in tetrahedral kite structures, believing they could form the basis of stable flying machines. The AEA disbanded in 1909, but Bell's contributions to early aviation remained critical. Hydrofoils and water innovation. Another of Bell's lesser-known but remarkable achievements was his work on hydrofoils. Obsessed with speed and efficiency on water, Bell and his collaborator Frederick Casey Baldwin designed and built a hydrofoil boat named the HD-4. After years of development and testing in Brodor Lake, the HD-4 set a world water speed record in 1919, reaching 71 miles per hour, 114 kilometers per hour. This achievement was groundbreaking. Though hydrofoils never became mainstream, Bell had once again pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. His work on watercraft also included early thoughts on renewable energy, using wind and wave power ideas far ahead of their time. Explorations in medicine and the human condition. Bell's commitment to human well-being extended into medical innovation. He experimented with devices to assist the deaf, including an induction balance to locate bullets in the human body, which he developed after President James Garfield was shot in 1881, an early prototype of a metal detector, a vacuum jacket to assist breathing in infants, a precursor to the iron lung. He also explored the idea of genetic inheritance of deafness, which led to controversy. Bell suggested discouraging marriages between deaf individuals, fearing a deaf variety of humans could emerge. Though well-meaning, his views were later criticized by the deaf community and scholars. Nevertheless, Bell's medical interests revealed his enduring belief that science must serve humanity. Awards, honors, and recognition. Bell's achievements did not go unnoticed. Throughout his lifetime, he received honorary degrees from major universities including Harvard and Oxford, fellowships and medals from prestigious scientific societies, personal audiences with world leaders and royalty, a legacy so powerful that Bell Labs, founded by AT&T, would become one of the most legendary research institutions in the 20th century, yet he remained modest, once saying, "The day will come when the man at the telephone will be able to see the distant person to whom he is speaking," a prophecy fulfilled decades later through video calling. Chapter 5. The Final Years and Enduring Legacy. A Life Well Lived. By the 1912nd and 1922nd, Alexander Graham Bell was no longer just an inventor. He had become a living symbol of scientific imagination. He was often referred to as the father of the telephone, but to those closest to him, he remained the gentle, thoughtful Alec who never stopped asking questions. Now in his 70s, Bell spent most of his time at his Bine Brae estate in Nova Scotia, surrounded by family, students, collaborators, and the stunning landscape he loved so dearly. There, in the tranquility of Broaddoor Lake, he worked on pet projects, read voraciously, and welcomed curious minds into his laboratory. Although his physical energy waned, his mental sharpness did not. Until the very end, he remained deeply interested in science, human health, nature, and technology. The family man, Bell's relationship with Mabel had only grown deeper over the decades. Their marriage, marked by shared passion and mutual respect, was among the most admired of their generation. Mabel was his confidant, financier, and emotional compass. He called her the one constant point in my storm of ideas. Their daughters, Elsie Mae and Marion, inherited the intellectual spirit of their parents. The Bell family often hosted guests from around the world, scientists, educators, politicians, and deaf students. Brae had become a private haven of innovation and inclusion. Despite their losses, the deaths of their 2 infant sons, and the challenges of raising a family always in the public eye, Mabel and Alec remained steadfast in their devotion to each other and to the idea that science should improve human lives. Final inventions and writings. Even in his last decade, Bell continued inventing. He experimented with devices for the deaf and hearing impaired, methods of renewable energy production, the phonetic alphabet to simplify world languages, improved recording technology. He also became more philosophical, writing essays and reflections on the relationship between science and society, the responsibility of inventors, and the ethical boundaries of technology. He strongly believed that education should be available to all, especially the deaf, and donated vast sums to institutions that shared this mission. He remained actively involved in organizations like the National Geographic Society, of which he served as president from 1898 to 1903, helping transform it from a dull scholarly group into a global platform for exploration and discovery. The last days. By 1922, Bell's health was fading. He suffered from complications related to diabetes, and the exertion of decades of work had taken a toll. Mabel remained by his side, caring for him as lovingly as he had once cared for her. On the 2nd of August, 1922, Alexander Graham Bell passed away at Bine Brae, surrounded by his loved ones. He was 75 years old. The world mourned. When word of his death reached the United States, something extraordinary happened. At 6:25 p.m. on the 4th of August, 1922, every telephone in North America fell silent for 1 full minute in honor of the man who had made it possible for voices to travel through wires. Operators stood at attention. Switchboards went dark. The silence was deafening and profound. The burial at Bean Bray. Bell's body was placed in a simple casket, draped in the tartan of his Scottish heritage. He was buried on a hilltop overlooking the lake, not far from his laboratory. Mabel chose the location herself, a place where the wind whispered through the pines and the sky opened wide to the stars. It was a peaceful place, just as Bell would have wanted. Mabel followed him in death just 5 months later, passing away in January 1923. She was buried beside him. Their graves remain at Bean Bray, marked only by modest stones and surrounded by nature, a legacy that spans centuries. Alexander Graham Bell left behind a legacy few have ever matched. The telephone, which redefined human connection, advances in sound recording, leading to modern media, contributions to aviation, hydrofoils, medical technology, and deaf education, philanthropic support of science, education, and exploration, personal inspiration to thousands of students, inventors, and deaf individuals. He was a teacher, a dreamer, a humanist, and above all, a relentless explorer of what it means to be human in a technological world. Recognition and honors. Bell's name is inscribed across history. Bell Laboratories, the birthplace of the transistor, laser, and modern computing, the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, advocating for auditory education, multiple museums, schools, and awards in his honor, a permanent exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution. His life has been portrayed in film, studied in universities, and celebrated in textbooks. Yet no accolade ever captured the full richness of the man who once said, "The only difference between success and failure is the ability to take action." The human behind the genius. Alexander Graham Bell was not just a great inventor, he was a man who loved deeply, listened patiently, and believed that every voice deserved to be heard. He never saw his inventions as ends in themselves. Rather, he viewed them as bridges between people, between ideas, between the silent and the heard. To this day, every time a voice travels across a wire, a fiber, or a satellite, it echoes the original spark that Bell ignited more than a century ago. Echoes through time the modern impact of Alexander Graham Bell, from wires to waves. A world built on Bell's vision. When Alexander Graham Bell first uttered the words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," he could never have imagined how far his voice would echo into the future. The crude wires and diaphragms of 1,876 have given way to fiber optics, satellites, and wireless networks. Yet at the heart of every phone call, every voice memo, every video conference lies the same principle: transforming the human voice into an electrical signal and transmitting it across space. Today we live in a world where smartphones fit into our pockets and connect us instantly to anyone on Earth. Zoom and FaceTime make real-time video conversations possible across continents. Speech recognition, text-to-speech, and AI voice assistants like Siri and Alexa are commonplace. 5-gram and optical fiber make communication faster and clearer than ever imagined. These technologies may seem far removed from Bell's experiments with magnetic reeds and wax cylinders, but the conceptual foundation remains his. Every call, every voice note, every conference line is a distant descendant of that first scratchy transmission in a Boston workshop. Bell Labs, the giant he inspired. In 1925, the Bell Telephone Company spun off a research division known as Bell Telephone Laboratories, or simply Bell Labs. What followed was one of the most remarkable periods of innovation in scientific history. Bell Labs produced the transistor, which enabled the digital revolution, the laser, now used in surgery, communication, and entertainment, solar cells, satellite technology, and fiber optics, Foundational work in information theory and digital communication, Unix operating system, and the C programming language, which power modern computers. While Alexander Graham Bell himself did not oversee these achievements, his commitment to experimentation, scientific rigor, and interdisciplinary thinking made Bell Labs possible. His legacy wasn't just the telephone, it was the culture of curiosity and collaboration that fueled 20th century innovation. The deaf community and Bell's complicated legacy. Bell's relationship with the deaf community remains complex. While he devoted much of his life to helping the deaf learn to speak, his advocacy for oralism over sign language has drawn criticism. He believed that deaf individuals would integrate more fully into society if they could speak and lip read, and he feared that the use of sign language would create a separate deaf culture. Modern advocates recognize Bell's good intentions, but also understand the harm that oralist policies inflicted, especially in suppressing American Sign Language, ASL, and deaf identity. Yet Bell also funded schools, supported deaf educators, and worked closely with Helen Keller, helping her achieve communication through touch and spoken language. His home was always open to deaf students. He was, at once, a pioneer and a product of his time. Today, the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing continues to support auditory education and hearing technology, while also promoting inclusivity and dialogue with deaf-led organizations. Bell, the educator, philosopher, and environmentalist. Long before climate change entered the global conversation, Bell was experimenting with renewable energy at Bean Bray. He built wind turbines, studied solar heating, and believed that clean energy would one day power the world. He was also an early advocate of interdisciplinary learning, merging science, language, medicine, and engineering. He believed that education should not be siloed and that students should be encouraged to ask big, sometimes impractical questions. His writings from the last decade of his life, published in various scientific journals, read not as technical manuals, but as meditations on the role of science in shaping humanity. He asked questions like, should technology always be pursued if it is possible? What responsibilities do inventors have to the public? How can science preserve, rather than replace, the human spirit? These questions remain deeply relevant today. Commemorations and global honors. Across the world, Bell's name continues to resonate. Museums. The Alexander Graham Bell National Historic Site in Baddeck, Nova Scotia, houses many of his personal effects, inventions, and original notebooks. Institutions. Schools, libraries, and research centers in both the U.S. and Canada bear his name. Stamps and currency. Bell has appeared on Canadian and U.S. postage, coins, and commemorative notes. Hollywood and media. Bell's life has inspired numerous documentaries, films, and biographies. He remains a symbol of creative genius and persistence. His voice, the first ever to be transmitted via wire, was restored in 2013 using digital audio analysis of a wax disc recorded in 1885. After more than a century of silence, we can now hear Bell say, "Hear my voice, Alexander Graham Bell." It was as though the inventor had returned, reminding us not just of his technology, but of his humanity. The eternal spark. Alexander Graham Bell never sought fame. He avoided the public spotlight whenever he could, and often declined interviews and honors. He didn't want statues, he wanted progress. To him, invention was never about glory. It was about unlocking potential, not only in wires and machines, but in people. The deaf child learning to speak, the inventor chasing a dream, the teacher sparking a light in a young mind. He once said, "Leave the beaten track occasionally and dive into the woods. Every time you do, you will be certain to find something you have never seen before." That perhaps is Bell's greatest legacy, the invitation to explore, to imagine, and to never stop listening for the unknown. In a world addicted to speed, connectivity, and instant communication, We owe much to the man who first asked if a voice could travel over a wire. Alexander Graham Bell opened the door not just to invention, but to understanding. His journey from the cobbled streets of Edinburgh, through the classrooms of Boston, to the quiet lakes of Nova Scotia, is more than a story of invention. It is a story of empathy, perseverance, and hope told through 1,000 calls, 1,000,000 messages, and the countless lives touched by his voice. And even now, somewhere in the gentle hum of every signal and every ring, we hear a quiet echo of the man who made the world a little smaller and a little more human. Chapter 6. Bell's Family Tree. Influences Across Generations. The Inheritance of Voice. The life of Alexander Graham Bell did not emerge from a vacuum. His genius, drive, and passion for sound were born into a lineage steeped in speech, language, and elocution. To understand Bell fully, one must look beyond him to the family legacy that shaped his destiny. This chapter uncovers the voices behind the inventor, his father, his grandfather, and the culture of sound that surrounded him from birth. Alexander Bell Sr., the voice doctor. Bell's father, Alexander Melville Bell, was born in 1819-inch Edinburgh, Scotland. A brilliant teacher and author, he became world-renowned for his work in elocution and phonetics. His greatest contribution was the development of a visual phonetic system called visible speech, a series of symbols representing the position of the tongue, lips, and vocal cords during sound production. Melville believed that spoken language could be taught visually even to the deaf. His system, though complex, offered a structured way to bridge silent and spoken communication. It laid the theoretical groundwork for what would become speech therapy and was used in schools for the deaf across Europe and North America. Melville also authored over 50 books, including Visible Speech, The Science of Universal Alphabetics, 1867. The Standard Elocutionist, which became a textbook in many schools. A strict but loving father, Melville, recognized Alec's curiosity early on and began tutoring him in phonetics and anatomy. In Alec's teenage years, the two often debated theory and conducted sound experiments together. Though they would sometimes clash over method and ambition, it was clear that Melville had instilled in his son a deep reverence for the spoken word. Eliza Grace Simons Bell, the quiet genius. Alexander's mother, Eliza Grace Simons Bell, was equally influential, if not more so. Born in England in 1809, she was a gifted pianist and deeply cultured woman. Despite becoming profoundly deaf in early adulthood, she remained intellectually engaged, communicating through lip reading and writing. It was Eliza who introduced Alec to vibration as sensation. Since she couldn't hear him speak, he would press his lips near her forehead so she could feel his words. This tactile method of communication planted a powerful idea in Alec's mind, that sound could be perceived through touch, and that hearing wasn't just about the ears, it was about the brain. Eliza also encouraged his creativity. She nurtured his love for poetry, art, and invention. She taught him to play piano, instilled in him a love of music, and gave him the emotional sensitivity that would later define his teaching style. Bell later said of his mother, "She taught me that silence does not mean emptiness, and that sound can be felt, not just heard. My first lessons in acoustics came not from textbooks, but from her presence." The original Alexander Bell, a grandfather of sound. Alexander Graham Bell was named after his grandfather, Alexander Bell, Sr., a well-respected elocutionist and orator in Scotland. The elder Bell worked as a public speaker, voice coach, and theater diction consultant, known for his thunderous voice and flair for dramatic delivery. He was deeply passionate about language clarity, believing that how one spoke could shape their future. His lessons were as theatrical as they were scientific, emphasizing breath control, tone, posture, and audience engagement. He passed this showman's understanding of the human voice down through his son Melville and grandson Alec. Though he died when Alec was still young, his reputation and legacy lived on in the household. It was said that he once trained British actors and even members of Parliament. He believed that a voice, properly trained, could change the world. That belief would one day take the form of a telephone. The Bell brothers. Loss and inspiration. Alexander Graham Bell had two brothers, Melville James Bell, born 1845, and Edward Charles Bell, born 1848. Both were bright and artistic. Melville Jr. was a talented organist, while Edward showed promise in science. Tragically, both would die young of tuberculosis, leaving Alec as the sole surviving son. The deaths of his brothers profoundly affected Alec. He became obsessed with disease, survival, and the fragility of life. These themes would later influence his medical experiments and his urgency in pursuing inventions that could save lives, such as the metal detector designed to locate bullets in President Garfield's body. The grief also brought him closer to his father, with whom he began collaborating more deeply. Alec essentially became the heir to the family's intellectual tradition. Though Bell's sons died in infancy, he had two surviving daughters. Elsie May Bell, 1878-1964, intelligent and poised, she married Gilbert Grosvenor, the editor of National Geographic magazine. Together, they helped grow the National Geographic Society into a global educational force. Their descendants would continue the family's scientific and journalistic tradition. Marion Hubbard Bell, known as Daisy, 1880-1962. Quiet and reflective, Daisy was less involved in public life but remained close to her parents. She shared her father's love of music and often performed at Ben Bray during social gatherings. Both daughters received rich educations and traveled with their parents. They kept journals and correspondence that provide valuable insight into the Bell family's inner life, revealing a household that valued curiosity, empathy, and education above all. Across 3 generations, the Bell family held tightly to a few core principles. The power of speech. From grandfather to grandson, all believed that clear expression was a key to personal success and human connection. Education as empowerment. Each generation taught the next, formally and informally, to use knowledge in service of others. Science for humanity. Whether it was Eliza's music, Melville's phonetics, or Alec's telephone, every Bell believed that learning should lead to compassion. These values created a ripple effect not just in the family, but in the institutions they helped shape. From the Volta Bureau to National Geographic, the Bell name would become synonymous with enlightenment and access. Chapter 7. The Making of the Telephone. A technical deep dive. The problem to solve. Can voice travel on a wire? In the early 1872nd, telegraphy dominated communication across long distances. It could transmit messages through Morse code dots and dashes sent over copper wires. But Alexander Graham Bell wasn't satisfied with coded pulses. He asked a far more radical question. Can the actual sound of the human voice, its tone, rhythm, and pitch, be transmitted electrically over a wire? No one had done it before. The human voice is analog, rich with continuous waves of pressure and vibration. Telegraphs, by contrast, used digital-like pulses, on or off, click or silence. Bell's great insight was that, to transmit speech, he'd need to capture and replicate the variations in sound itself, not just the occurrence of a sound. This chapter breaks down how Bell tackled the challenge from a technical and scientific perspective. What is sound? Bell's acoustic understanding. Bell had studied the science of sound with passion. His training in phonetics, anatomy, and physics gave him a strong foundation to work from. Here are the basic principles he worked with. Sound is vibration. When you speak, your vocal cords vibrate the air. Vibrations travel through a medium. In air, these vibrations are detected by ears. In a wire, they might become electrical impulses. Each sound wave has frequency and amplitude. Frequency defines pitch, amplitude defines volume. To capture the essence of speech, Bell needed a way to translate the physical vibration of sound into electricity and then recreate it at a distance. Bell's early devices, the liquid transmitter. One of Bell's earliest attempts was a liquid transmitter, developed in 1876. It was clunky but innovative. How it worked? A diaphragm was stretched over a mouthpiece. When the speaker talked, it vibrated. A needle connected to the diaphragm was suspended in acidulated water with sulfuric acid. As the diaphragm vibrated, the needle moved up and down in the liquid, modulating an electrical circuit. This device changed resistance in the circuit in response to sound vibrations, creating electrical variations that mimicked the original sound wave. At the receiving end, these signals were converted back into sound through an electromagnet and diaphragm. Bell called this his liquid telephone. Though primitive, it was the first working device to transmit intelligible speech. The role of Thomas Watson. Bell's collaborator, Thomas A. Watson, was an experienced electrical technician where Bell theorized, Watson built. Watson improved the stability of the device, fine-tuned the receiver diaphragms, and experimented with different materials and magnetic coils. He built countless iterations of transmitters using iron reeds, paper membranes, wire coils, horseshoe magnets, glass and copper diaphragms. Watson's intuition about magnetic induction, how changing magnetic fields can induce current in a coil, helped Bell's vision become a reality. Together, they created a working electromagnetic transmitter and receiver that no longer required acid or water. This became the foundation of modern telephone technology. The historic moment, the 10th of March, 1876. Bell's notes from that day were short but powerful. I then shouted into mouthpiece the following sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." To my delight, he came and declared that he had heard and understood what I said. The transmission had worked. The setup included a battery-powered transmitter with a flexible diaphragm and coil, a receiver with a magnetic reed that vibrated sympathetically with the electrical signal, both connected by wires in the same building. That was the world's first telephone call and the proof that analog sound waves could be sent through electricity. The final telephone model of 1876, Bell's improved telephone consisted of a mouthpiece transmitter, where a thin diaphragm vibrated with speech, an electromagnet to convert vibration into fluctuating current, a receiver that used the magnetic signal to revibrate another diaphragm, a two-wire connection. For full duplex communication, his design did not amplify the voice, it simply recreated it at the other end by using sympathetic vibrations. Voices were faint but intelligible. By 1877, Watson had refined the design into a wooden box with a handheld receiver much closer to what we now imagine as an old-fashioned telephone. Key principles in Bell's telephone. Variable resistance. Speech caused variations in electrical current mirroring the audio waveform. Electromagnetic induction. A changing magnetic field induced a current in a wire coil. Sympathetic vibration. A diaphragm at the receiver recreated the vibration and produced audible sound. Analog signal transmission. Unlike Morse code's binary system, Bell's signal preserved waveform fidelity. These principles still underpin today's audio transmission systems, including microphones, speakers, and even digital to analog conversion. Competing designs. Elisha Gray's liquid transmitter. On the very day Bell's patent was filed, the 14th of February, 1876, another inventor, Elisha Gray, filed a caveat an intent to patent, for a very similar liquid transmitter. Both designs used a diaphragm connected to a needle, acidulated water to modulate current, sound vibrations translated into variable resistance. The similarity sparked accusations of idea, theft, and patent interference. But Bell had filed first, and though Gray's design was similar, Bell's team had a working model. Bell was granted the patent on the 7th of March, 1876. Western Union and the Patent Wars. Once Bell's telephone was public, the Western Union Telegraph Company, a communications giant, challenged his patent. They backed rival inventors and tried to develop a competing system. From 1878 to 1887, Bell's legal team faced over 600 lawsuits, including from Western Union, Thomas Edison, Elisha Gray, multiple independent inventors. Each claimed Bell's patent was too broad or derivative. However, Bell's team had clear documentation, dated prototypes, and credible witnesses, including Watson. In a series of legal victories, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Bell's claim. His original patent number 174,465 remained intact, securing his place as the official inventor of the telephone. Refinements and innovations. After 1876, once the concept was proven, Bell and Watson improved. Handset design, separating transmitter and receiver. Switchboards for connecting multiple users. Telephone exchanges. Centralized calling hubs. Long-distance transmission, using amplifiers and relays. By the 1882nd, the Bell Telephone Company was licensing technology across the U.S. The number of phones exploded from a handful in 1877 to over 150,000 by 1886. From analog to digital, Bell's lasting impact. Though Bell's original phone was analog, his invention laid the blueprint for modern communication. Microphones still use vibrating diaphragms and magnetic coils. Speakers and headphones reverse the process, turning current into sound. Digital audio still mimics analog waveforms, but uses binary encoding. Fiber optics carry modulated light waves in patterns that echo Bell's wave-based thinking. Even voice over IP, VoIP, systems used in Zoom and Skype rely on capturing voice as analog signals, converting them into data packets, and reconstructing them at the destination. Bell's original idea that voice is a waveform that can travel remains as vital in the 21st century as it was in 1876. Chapter 8. The Patent Wars, Legal Battles and Corporate Takeover. The prize. Ownership of the future. The telephone was not just a scientific breakthrough, it was a gold mine. Whoever owned the rights to it would control the next era of communication. For Alexander Graham Bell, the fight to protect his invention would soon become one of the most bitter and legendary legal battles in the history of American innovation. Between 1876 and 1887, Bell and his backers faced an astonishing over 600 lawsuits challenging his claims to the telephone patent. These suits came from rival inventors, independent builders, and most dangerously, the dominant tech power of the age, the Western Union Telegraph Company. This chapter explores the legal war to control the telephone and how it helped forge the Bell system, the ancestor of modern telecommunications giants. The patent filing, hours that changed history. On the 14th of February, 1876, Bell's attorney filed U.S. Patent Number 174,465, covering his method of and apparatus for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically. This was 3 hours before Elisha Gray filed a caveat for a very similar idea. This timing would prove crucial. The patent granted to Bell was astonishingly broad. It covered the principle of transmitting voice using variable electric current. Even crude copies or similar mechanisms were now legally considered infringements, regardless of minor differences in design. Western Union and many others believed Bell's patent should never have been granted. Western Union, the Goliath opponent. Western Union had spent decades building the telegraph empire across North America. When Bell introduced a device that threatened to make the telegraph obsolete, they saw it as an existential threat. Western Union's team of lawyers and engineers attempted to develop their own telephone system, claimed that Bell's invention was already public domain. Support rival inventors like Daniel Drawbaugh, Amos Dolbear, and Elisha Gray. Argue that Bell had stolen Gray's liquid transmitter idea. Western Union also claimed that their engineer Thomas Edison had improved the telephone beyond Bell's capability and that the Bell Company should be dissolved. Bell, still more scientist than businessman, left most of the legal work to Gardner Green Hubbard, Thomas Sanders, and their legal team. The legal battle, Bell versus the world. The legal war took place in multiple phases. 1. Bell versus Elisha Gray. Gray's claim was based on a caveat, not a full patent. In court, Bell's side showed that Bell had begun experimenting months earlier, that Gray had not built a working device, that Bell's design was more fully realized. Gray eventually lost, though the controversy never completely faded. 2. Bell versus Western Union. The most dangerous case came in 1878 when Western Union formally backed Drawbaugh, who claimed he had built a talking telegraph years before Bell, but he had no working model, no lab records, and no public demonstrations prior to 1876. Western Union also supported Dolbear, who argued that Bell's method used known electrical science, but Dolbear's system lacked the necessary design to transmit continuous variable waves of speech. Bell's attorneys, led by Chauncey Smith, launched a defense that combined scientific demonstration, expert witnesses, lab notebooks, and dated correspondence, detailed comparisons of all known designs. After a long and grueling case, in 1879, Western Union settled. The settlement that changed everything. In a groundbreaking agreement, Western Union agreed to withdraw from the telephone business. They recognized Bell's patents. In exchange, they received 20% of Bell Telephone's royalties for 17 years. This settlement cemented Bell's dominance. It also avoided a Supreme Court ruling, which might have opened Bell's patent to further challenge. The business world now understood. Bell's telephone wasn't just an invention, it was a monopoly in the making. The Supreme Court and the final blow. Though the Western Union matter was settled, other lawsuits continued. In 1887, the most serious threat came in United States versus American Bell Telephone Company, where the U.S. government itself challenged Bell's patent as fraudulent. They argued that Bell may have stolen from Gray, the patent was too broad, there was collusion in the patent office. The trial was long and political, but Bell's side had detailed records, independent verification, and a proven working model. The court ruled decisively, the proof is conclusive, that Bell was the first to conceive and make a working telephone. His patent must be sustained. The Supreme Court affirmed the ruling. Bell had won for good. The birth of the Bell system. Following these victories, the Bell Telephone Company rapidly expanded, licensing its technology across the U.S. and forming regional subsidiaries. In 1885, the company created American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, to build a long-distance network. Over the next decades, the Bell system would become the largest corporation in America, a regulated natural monopoly, a pioneer of technological innovation through Bell Labs. Though Bell himself stepped away from business, his name remained at the core of this empire. The cost of victory. Despite winning legally, Bell's company faced criticism, monopoly accusations. By the early 1902, The Bell system controlled nearly all telephone lines in the U.S. High fees and limited competition led to public resentment. In 1913, AT&T signed the Kingsbury Commitment, agreeing to sell off Western Union and allow interconnection with independent carriers. Still, Bell's victory in court had ensured that the telephone would evolve within a centralized, well-funded system, helping finance research into transatlantic cables, radio, and satellite communication. Global impact of the legal precedent. Bell's success influenced international patent law and inspired inventors around the world to document their work more carefully, file patents as early as possible, defend their ideas with both science and law. It also led to the rise of patent brokers, technology licensing, and innovation clusters, the early foundations of modern tech economies like Silicon Valley. The Bell patent case became a landmark for how the U.S. government would protect inventors and regulate monopolies. Chapter 9. Bell and the Deaf. Educator, Advocate, and Controverse. A calling beyond invention. Before Alexander Graham Bell was known as the inventor of the telephone, he was known as a teacher of the deaf. In fact, it was through his work with the hearing impaired that he first began exploring the mechanics of sound, and it was the deaf community that inspired his most important breakthroughs. Bell's early fame did not come from patents or profits. It came from classrooms filled with silent students and the deep conviction that every individual, regardless of ability, deserved a voice. But this legacy is also complicated. While Bell made remarkable contributions to deaf education, he also promoted ideas especially about oralism versus sign language that remain controversial. This chapter explores Bell's work with the deaf, his advocacy, his inventions for speech training, and the legacy of both compassion and conflict he left behind. Shaped by silence. Bell's mother and his mission. Bell's connection to the deaf began at home. His mother, Eliza Grace Simons Bell, began losing her hearing in his childhood. As a boy, Alexander communicated with her by speaking low and clearly near her forehead so she could feel vibrations, writing messages in large, clear script, learning to read lips, and modifying his speech accordingly. This relationship had a lasting impact on Bell. He developed extraordinary sensitivity to nonverbal communication and became attuned to the nuances of facial expression, tone, and movement skills that would later define his teaching method. His understanding of deafness was not rooted in pity, but in respect. He once said, "The deaf are not disabled. They are simply outside the sounds we take for granted." Teaching the deaf in Boston. In the early 1872, Bell was invited to Boston, where he taught at the Boston School for the Deaf, the Clark School for the Deaf in Northampton, the American Asylum for the Deaf in Hartford. He quickly became renowned for his methods, which focused on oral instruction, teaching students to speak, read lips, and use visual phonetics, like his father's visible speech. He rejected the notion that deaf individuals could not learn to speak. He worked tirelessly to prove otherwise. Bell often taught by using tactile feedback, placing students' hands on his throat, lips, and cheeks, demonstrating mouth shapes and vocal vibrations, encouraging daily repetition, often practicing sounds for hours. He trained teachers, published manuals, and began giving lectures on elocution for the deaf. Meeting Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan, one of the most meaningful chapters of Bell's life began in 1886 when he was introduced to a 6-year-old girl from Alabama who was both deaf and blind. Her name was Helen Keller. Bell encouraged her parents to send her to the Perkins Institute for the Blind, where she was paired with teacher Anne Sullivan. Though Sullivan deserves credit for Keller's transformation, Bell played a crucial role in connecting them. Helen Keller later wrote, "Dr. Bell was one of the few people who treated me not as a curiosity, but as a person." Bell remained a lifelong mentor and friend to Keller, who came to see him as a second father. They corresponded frequently and debated education, policy, philosophy, and social justice. Founding the Volta Bureau. With funds from the Volta Prize, Bell founded the Volta Bureau for the increase and diffusion of knowledge relating to the deaf in Washington, D.C. in 1887. Its mission was to research methods of deaf education, to distribute educational materials, to archive case studies and teaching experiments. The building still stands today and serves as a historic center for deaf studies and audiology. Bell's inventions for the deaf. Bell invented or improved several devices designed to help people with hearing loss. Visible speech trainer, based on his father's system, used to help students learn the articulation of sounds. Audiometer, to measure hearing acuity and diagnose deafness. Multiple channel phonetic recorders, used to study and reproduce human speech. Early hearing devices, including vibrating discs and electromagnetic receivers. His experiments were often years ahead of their time and helped lay the foundation for modern audiology, speech therapy, and cochlear implants. The oralism debate. Bell's controversial views. Bell believed that deaf individuals should be integrated into mainstream society by learning to speak and read lips. He strongly advocated oralism, the exclusive use of spoken language over manualism, sign language. He argued that sign language isolated deaf people. Lip reading and speech would promote independence. Deafness, if unchecked, would become a separate race through intermarriage. He even warned that schools for the deaf should not encourage sign language or allow deaf teachers to marry. These views, published in papers such as Memoir Upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race, 1884, sparked outrage among advocates of deaf culture, many of whom saw sign language as an identity, not a limitation. Criticism and modern reassessment. Today, Bell is often criticized for his stance on oralism, which many say suppressed deaf culture, stigmatized sign language, and pushed harmful assimilationist policies. Many deaf historians argue that Bell's ideas led to policies that banned ASL in schools. Deaf children suffered emotionally and academically under forced oralism. Sign language is a complete and valid language with its own grammar and syntax, yet many also acknowledge Bell's sincere intent and enormous contributions to deaf education. He never saw the deaf as inferior. He simply believed that speech was the key to full citizenship. Organizations like the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, A.G. Bell, continue his mission, though with a broader understanding of inclusion and deaf rights. Bell's legacy in deaf education today. Bell's work inspired generations of educators and scientists. His legacy can be seen in modern speech therapy programs, lip reading instruction in schools, the development of hearing aids and assistive technology, research in cognitive linguistics and language acquisition, ongoing dialogue between oralist and signing communities. Most importantly, Bell elevated the issue of deaf education to a national and international level, ensuring that the topic remained in public discourse. Chapter 10. Bell and the National Geographic Society. From inventor to visionary leader, by the late 1892, Alexander Graham Bell had already changed the world with the telephone, transformed deaf education, and pioneered audio and speech technologies. But his impact didn't stop at wires and laboratories. In 1898, Bell took on a new role, one that would bring his passion for science, geography, education, and public engagement into a new and powerful arena, the National Geographic Society. This chapter tells the story of how Bell helped reinvent the National Geographic Society, turning it from a small scientific club into a globally influential organization that brought exploration, science, and culture to millions. The birth of a quiet institution. The National Geographic Society was founded in 1000 888-inch Washington, D.C., by a group of 33 scientists, explorers, and scholars, including geographer Gardner Green Hubbard Bell's father-in-law. The goal was simple: to increase and diffuse geographic knowledge. Early meetings were dry, filled with technical lectures that appealed to a small audience of scholars. The Society published a modest journal, the National Geographic magazine, but few outside academia read it. It was, by all accounts, a respectable but unremarkable organization. That changed when Bell was elected president in 1898, following Hubbard's death. A bold new direction. Bell had a vision. He believed science should inspire, not just inform. He thought geographic education should be visual, emotional, and accessible. Under his leadership, the Society would become not just a haven for scholars, but a bridge between scientific discovery and the general public. He pushed for major changes. Photography over charts. He encouraged the use of photographic storytelling instead of abstract graphs and maps. Accessible language. Bell demanded that articles be written in plain English, understandable to the average reader. Public distribution. He promoted the wide distribution of National Geographic magazine beyond academics and scientists. Bell once declared, "Geography is not a subject to be confined to the classroom. It is the study of the earth and all who inhabit it, and that concerns every man, woman, and child." Hiring Gilbert Grosvenor. A family legacy begins. In 1899, Bell hired his son-in-law, Gilbert Hovey Grosvenor, husband to Bell's daughter Elsie, to edit the magazine. It was a fateful decision. Grosvenor shared Bell's enthusiasm for communication, storytelling, and educational reform. Together, they transformed National Geographic from a scholarly bulletin into a world-class magazine known for stunning, full-page photographs from around the world, in-depth stories on natural wonders, cultures, and exploration. The iconic yellow border, introduced in 1910, clear narrative writing that engaged both the mind and the imagination. Grosvenor became editor-in-chief in 1903 and served for 55 years. His tenure made National Geographic a household name. Bell and Grosvenor's partnership laid the groundwork for science communication as we know it today. Exploration and global reach. Under Bell's presidency and Grosvenor's editorial leadership, the Society began funding expeditions. This included Arctic and Antarctic explorers like Robert E. Peary and Roald Amundsen, research into the Amazon basin, Africa, and Asia, underwater and aerial photography, early efforts in conservation and environmental awareness. These projects weren't just scientific, they were storytelling missions. The magazine brought images of Machu Picchu, the Congo, Mount Everest, and the depths of the ocean into homes around the world. Bell believed that visual storytelling could foster global understanding. He wanted people to see the world's diversity, fragility, and beauty, and to care. Education for all. One of Bell's greatest passions was public education. Through National Geographic, he reached millions with content that taught geography in new, experiential ways, sparked interest in earth sciences, biology, and anthropology, raised awareness about cultural diversity, human rights, and natural history. He often visited classrooms, brought maps and photographs to schools, and worked with educators to develop curriculum supplements using National Geographic materials. By the 1912, schools across America were using the magazine in geography and history classes. Bell's dream of science in service of society had come true. Legacy and lasting impact. Bell stepped down from the presidency of the Society in 1903, but his influence endured. Under Grosvenor and subsequent generations of the family, the Bell-Grosvenor dynasty led the Society for much of the 20th century. Today, the National Geographic Society is 2 of 1, a global nonprofit supporting scientific research and exploration, the publisher of one of the world's most iconic magazines, a leader in documentary, filmmaking, television, and digital storytelling, a key player in education, conservation, and climate awareness, its mission to inspire people to care about the planet stems directly from Bell's values: curiosity, inclusion, and wonder. Chapter 11. The Volta Bureau, Research and Philanthropy. From Prize to Purpose. In 1880, Alexander Graham Bell was awarded the Volta Prize, a prestigious international honor presented by the French government for extraordinary contributions to science. The award came with a generous purse of 50,000 francs, a substantial sum at the time. While many would have used the prize money for personal comfort, Bell chose a different path. He used every cent to establish a research institution dedicated to the deaf community, the advancement of hearing science, and the broader dissemination of scientific knowledge. Thus was born the Volta Bureau, a physical embodiment of Bell's core belief that science must serve society. A monument to learning. The Volta Bureau for the Increase and Diffusion of Knowledge Relating to the Deaf was formally established in 1887-inch Washington, D.C. Its early work focused on compiling and sharing research on deaf education, distributing information to teachers, families, and health professionals, promoting Bell's methods in oral instruction, archiving case studies, teaching manuals, and scientific papers. By 1893, the Bureau had its own permanent home, a striking Romanesque-style building at 1537 35th Street, NW, in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington. Bell oversaw its design and personally funded much of its construction. The building's stone facade bears the inscription, "Knowledge is Power." It remains a historical landmark to this day. The Bureau's scientific contributions. At the Volta Bureau, Bell and his colleagues conducted cutting-edge research on hearing thresholds and auditory perception, the anatomy and physiology of the ear, early forms of audiometry, hearing testing, inheritance patterns of deafness, the relationship between speech development and hearing ability. They collected thousands of audiological records, conducted interviews, and hosted lectures for specialists in speech, pathology, medicine, and education. Bell's audiometer, developed during this period, became a widely used tool to measure hearing loss. It offered a more standardized way to evaluate and diagnose auditory impairments. Support for teachers and schools. The Volta Bureau was not only a research institution, it was also a clearinghouse for educators working with the deaf. It provided free teaching guides and charts, reprints of scientific findings, training sessions in visible speech and oralist methods, public reports to guide school administrators and policymakers. Bell believed that teachers needed not just tools, but scientific understanding. He often argued that education must be rooted in experimentation, not dogma. His vision, to bring rigor, data, and compassion into the classroom. Volta Review and scholarly publishing. In 1899, the Bureau began publishing a journal called the Volta Review, which became the leading publication in the field of deaf education, audiology, and speech sciences. Topics included studies of deaf students' cognitive development, techniques in speech training, research in early childhood hearing loss, philosophical essays on the ethics of deaf instruction. Bell frequently contributed essays and editorials. His writing combined scientific precision with deep empathy. He never lost sight of the human stories behind the research. International collaborations and conferences. The Bureau also served as a hub for global scientific exchange. Bell hosted international conferences bringing together physicians and otologists, educators and linguists, inventors and engineers. He advocated for cross-border collaboration and emphasized the need for unified standards in education and testing. His goal was to ensure that deaf children everywhere, whether in Boston or Brussels, had access to the best possible instruction. In doing so, he helped globalize the field of deaf education. Criticism and defense. As with many of Bell's efforts in deaf education, the Volta Bureau attracted both praise and criticism. Advocates of sign language felt the Bureau overly promoted oralism at the expense of deaf culture. Some medical professionals disputed Bell's theories about the heredity of deafness, fearing they bordered on eugenics. Others accused the Bureau of privileging wealthy or elite institutions. Bell, though aware of the criticism, remained confident in his mission. He often responded publicly, inviting open dialogue and hosting forums for competing views. In his words, "Truth does not fear inspection. Let every method be tested not just by belief but by outcome." Philanthropy beyond the Bureau. The Volta Bureau was not Bell's only philanthropic venture. Throughout his life, he gave generously to schools for the deaf, including Gallaudet University and the Clark School, scientific institutions, including the Smithsonian and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, student scholarships for aspiring inventors, especially from underrepresented backgrounds, disaster relief and medical care. He once funded a hospital wing in memory of a student who died of fever. He also mentored young inventors, providing not just funds, but access to his labs and networks. A living legacy. After Bell's death, the Volta Bureau continued its work. Today, it is operated by the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, A.G. Bell. The organization's mission has evolved with the times, and it now supports listening and spoken language instruction, offers family and early intervention programs, funds research into modern hearing technologies like cochlear implants, advocates for accessibility and inclusion. While debates over educational methods persist, A.G. Bell remains a pillar of support for families navigating childhood hearing loss. Chapter 12. Bell's Experiments Never Told. The Forgotten Inventions. Beyond the Telephone. An Inventor's Restless Mind. Though Alexander Graham Bell is best known for the telephone, his inventive spirit didn't stop there. He once described himself not as a businessman, but as an experimentalist by nature. His notebooks, often written late into the night, overflowed with sketches, designs, formulas, and wild ideas. Many of these inventions never made headlines, but they tell us a great deal about the curiosity, humanism, and futurism that defined Bell's inner world. This chapter dives into Bell's forgotten experiments, from medical devices and futuristic transit systems to energy experiments and early ideas that bordered on science fiction. 1. The metal detector for President Garfield. In 1881, President James A. Garfield was shot by an assassin. As surgeons struggled to locate the bullet lodged in his abdomen, Bell offered help. He designed an induction balance device, a forerunner of the modern metal detector, which used electromagnetic fields to locate metallic objects in the human body. Despite the ingenuity of the device, it failed in Garfield's case due to interference from the metal bed frame and incorrect assumptions about the bullet's location. Nevertheless, Bell's work laid the foundation for modern, non-invasive detection methods in medicine and security. 2. The vacuum jacket, precursor to the iron lung. In the 1882nd, Bell developed a vacuum jacket to aid breathing in children suffering from respiratory paralysis, especially conditions like polio. The jacket worked by creating a negative pressure around the chest, helping the lungs expand and contract. This design was a precursor to the iron lung, which would save thousands of lives in the 20th century. Though the device was never mass-produced, Bell's notes and schematics were later studied by medical engineers working on mechanical ventilation systems. 3. The photophone, light-based communication. One of Bell's most fascinating inventions was the photophone, patented in 1880. It worked by converting the speaker's voice into modulated light, beaming that light to a receiver, reconverting the light into sound using a selenium cell. This was, essentially, wireless communication via light, a forerunner to fiber optics and laser-based communication. Bell was so excited by the invention that he said, "The photophone is the greatest invention I have ever made, greater than the telephone." Unfortunately, the technology of the time couldn't support widespread deployment, but the core principle using light to carry voice and data would reemerge in the 20th century in fiber optic cables. 4. Tetrahedral kites and flying machines. In his later years, Bell became obsessed with flight. At his Bine-Bray laboratory in Nova Scotia, he experimented with kite designs built from tetrahedral cells, geometrically stable shapes that could be stacked to create large flying structures. His most famous creation, the Frost King, was a massive tetrahedral kite that flew to over 100 feet and carried the weight of a person. Bell believed tetrahedrons could be the key to safe, stable air travel. While airplanes eventually took a different path, fixed wings and propellers, Bell's designs were among the earliest attempts at aerial engineering beyond balloons. 5. Hydrofoils and watercraft speed records. Bell and his collaborator Casey Baldwin designed and tested a series of hydrofoil boats on Brasdor Lake in the 1,910 second. Their most successful creation, the HD-4, reached 71 miles per hour in 1919, setting a world marine speed record at the time. The HD-4 used underwater foils that lifted the boat above water at high speed, reducing drag. This same principle is now used in modern high-speed ferries, military vessels, and racing yachts. Bell envisioned a future where cities and countries would be connected by ultra-fast hydrofoil fleets decades before the technology caught on. 6. Alternative fuels and energy storage. Bell was deeply concerned about the sustainability of fossil fuels, even as early as the 1,910 second. He explored methanol and ethanol as alternative fuels, solar heating systems using reflectors and black box absorption, compressed air systems for storing mechanical energy. He wrote in his journals, "The unchecked consumption of coal and oil will someday bring us to ruin. Nature gives us sun, water, and wind. We must listen." Bell's predictions about climate change, resource depletion, and the need for renewable energy were eerily ahead of their time. 7. Early genetics and selective breeding. Bell also conducted studies on heredity, especially concerning deafness. While his interest stemmed from compassion, some of his ideas veered into ethically gray territory. He collected data on marriage patterns among the deaf, attempting to correlate genetic factors and the likelihood of deaf children. He advocated for educating deaf individuals about heredity, but critics feared his work could be misused for eugenic policies. Though never aligned with coercive practices, Bell's work in this field remains controversial. However, it did contribute to the foundations of genetic counseling and hereditary research. 8. The dream of a universal language. Bell, like his father, believed that a simplified, universal language could unite people across cultures. He developed modified versions of visible speech to represent all phonetic sounds, proposals for phonetic spelling in English, a theoretical global alphabet based on universal articulation. Though his vision never gained wide traction, it prefigured modern efforts like IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet. Constructed languages like Esperanto, translation technology using phoneme recognition, To Bell, language was not a barrier, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. 9. Early thoughts on automation and artificial intelligence. Bell frequently speculated about thinking machines and automation. In notes from 1909, he wrote, "A machine that could listen, compare, and decide, that would be a marvel. Perhaps one day it shall be." While Bell didn't use terms like artificial intelligence, he imagined machines that could understand speech, devices that responded to vocal commands, tools that could analyze sound patterns for diagnosis or translation. These musings placed him among the early dreamers of cognitive technology. 10. Lost notebooks and unfinished ideas. Bell's archives contain hundreds of incomplete ideas. Some notable sketches and fragments include a gyroscopic stabilizer for trains and ships, a wireless telegraphy beacon for ship navigation, a speech-to-print transcriber using vibrating wires, a portable electric fan for cooling patients with fever, a design for aerial mail delivery using tethered balloons. Though most of these were never built, they reflect a mind that never stopped reaching toward the future. Why many inventions stayed hidden. Several reasons explain why Bell's lesser-known inventions remained in the shadows. Lack of commercial partners. Technological limitations of the era, Bell's lack of interest in profit, the overshadowing success of the telephone. For Bell, invention was not about success, it was about the process. He often said, "An idea that is not dangerous is unworthy of being called an idea at all." Chapter 13. Bell's role in the early recording industry. The power to preserve a voice. Long before streaming platforms, vinyl records, or cassette tapes, sound was fleeting once spoken. It vanished into the air. Alexander Graham Bell, the man who made it possible to send voice over wires, also played a pivotal role in capturing that voice, preserving it, replaying it, and eventually commercializing it. Though Thomas Edison is often credited with the invention of the phonograph, Bell's graphophone marked the transition from scientific novelty to practical industry. Without Bell's innovations in sound recording, the music, podcast, and voice technology industries would look vastly different today. This chapter explores how Bell reshaped the early recording industry, paving the way for the era of sound on demand. The shortcomings of Edison's phonograph. When Edison introduced the phonograph in 1877, it was celebrated as a marvel. Using a stylus, vibrations from a speaker's voice were etched onto a rotating cylinder wrapped in tinfoil. A playback stylus could then retrace the grooves, producing a tinny but audible echo of the original voice. The device was revolutionary, but it had major limitations. Tinfoil was fragile and wore out quickly. The audio was unclear and distorted. It was hard to mass produce. There was no effective way to duplicate recordings. By the early 1882nd, Edison had moved on to focus on electric lighting, and development of the phonograph stalled. That's when Bell and his team stepped in. Enter the Volta Laboratory team. Funded by his Volta Prize, Bell established the Volta Laboratory in Washington, D.C. in 1880. He was joined by Chichester A. Bell, his cousin, a chemist, Charles Sumner Taylor, a brilliant young engineer and instrument maker. Together, they began reimagining sound recording. Their goal was not just to record, but to make recording reliable, repeatable, and useful in daily life. By 1886, their solution had a name, the graphophone, a major leap forward. The graphophone improved upon the phonograph in several ways. 1. Wax cylinders. Instead of tinfoil, Bell and his team developed wax-coated cardboard cylinders that could be more deeply engraved. Wax was durable, easier to duplicate, and produced clearer sound. 2. Floating stylus design. The stylus floated more naturally, following the grooves with less resistance. This reduced wear and tear on both stylus and cylinder. 3. Improved drive mechanism. Instead of hand cranks, many graphophones used foot pedals or electric motors, providing more consistent rotation. 4. Speech clarity. Bell's team used insights from his speech science background to better reproduce vocal tones and resonance. The result was a device that could faithfully record and playback speech, music, or sound effects with far greater fidelity than Edison's original. Creating a business, American Graphophone Company. In 1887, Bell and his team formed the Volta Graphophone Company, which soon merged with American Graphophone Company, a firm set up to commercialize the new invention. They began manufacturing graphophones for business dictation, selling to offices, courts, and medical facilities, advertising the device for letter writing, document dictation, and message storage. Their technology caught on quickly in professional environments. Meanwhile, the American Graphophone Company would later evolve into Columbia Records, one of the earliest and most influential recording companies in the world. Bell had just helped launch the modern audio industry. Patent battles with Edison resume. Unsurprisingly, Edison returned to the scene. With the phonograph back in his sights, he created new wax-based designs that mirrored many of Bell's improvements. This reignited the rivalry between the two giants. Edison claimed Bell had refined but not invented the concept. Bell's team argued their changes were fundamental and patentable as distinct inventions. In courtrooms and boardrooms, the two sides battled for control of the fledgling recording industry. Eventually, they reached cross-licensing agreements allowing Edison's phonograph company, Bell's American Graphophone, Columbia. Later, the Victor Talking Machine Company to share technology, leading to faster industry growth. From business machines to music and entertainment, though the graphophone began as a dictation tool, it wasn't long before entrepreneurs realized its potential for entertainment. By the 1892nd, wax cylinders carried popular songs, speeches, and theatrical performances. By 1901, cylinder recordings were sold in catalogs and department stores. The industry shifted from one-off recordings to mass duplication. Bell's wax cylinder system allowed for batch production, enabling the creation of the first commercial music market. While others made the stars, Bell had built the stage. The cultural impact of Bell's recording technology. Bell's innovations led to a series of cascading effects. Preservation of historical voices, political speeches, famous poets, and early broadcasters, educational tools for teaching languages, pronunciation, and music, forensic and legal uses, early voice evidence, dictation archiving, radio and cinema, as sound-on-disc technology evolved into sound-on-film. Without Bell's wax cylinder technology, the age of radio, gramophones, jukeboxes, and eventually CDs and MP3 second might have been significantly delayed. Why Bell never sought musical fame? Despite his enormous contribution, Bell never sought credit in the entertainment industry. He was uninterested in celebrity or show business. For him, the purpose of the graphophone was practical: to make information portable, to allow people to communicate across time, to give the human voice a permanent place in history. He wrote, "The telephone carried a voice across space. The graphophone carries it across time, the forgotten genius behind the mic." Today, when we think of music, podcasts, and voice recordings, we often overlook Alexander Graham Bell, but his work in this field was visionary. He saw a future where teachers could teach thousands at once. Doctors could consult through voice recordings. Voices would outlive their speakers. That future is our present. Chapter 14. Bell the Philosopher: Speeches, Diaries, and Ethical Views. Beyond the lab, a thinker with a conscience. Though known to the world as an inventor and scientist, Alexander Graham Bell was also a man of deep thought, moral questioning, and social reflection. His diaries, speeches, letters, and personal writings reveal a mind constantly asking, what is the purpose of invention? What responsibility does a scientist owe to society? Bell saw invention not merely as a mechanical act, but as a moral endeavor, a force that could either uplift or destroy, depending on how it was wielded. His journals are filled with musings on the future of civilization, education, equality, and the power and danger of technology. This chapter explores Bell's philosophical insights, his public speeches, and the moral compass that guided his prolific life. The Diary as a Mirror. Bell was a dedicated diarist. From the age of 16 until his death in 1922, he kept meticulous records, not just of experiments, but of dreams, doubts, and dialogue with himself. Recurring themes in his diaries included the ethics of progress. He questioned whether every innovation was good simply because it was possible. Fear of misuse. He worried that communication tools might be turned into tools of control or war. Wonder for nature. He wrote often about nature's beauty and how science should preserve, not destroy, the earth. Hope for education. He believed that ignorance was the root of most human suffering. In a 1907 entry, Bell wrote, "We are racing ahead with discovery, but is our wisdom keeping pace with our power?" The responsibilities of the inventor. Bell frequently gave speeches to students, scientists, and political leaders. His most famous theme, the ethical obligations of the inventor. In a 1911 lecture to young engineers, he warned, "You may design machines to lift men to the skies, but ask yourself always, do they lift their hearts as well?" He argued that inventors must consider the long-term effects of their creations, share knowledge openly, but guard against exploitation, use their voices to advocate for equity and accessibility. Bell urged inventors not to chase profit or fame, but to solve real problems, especially those of the marginalized and voiceless. On War and Peace, though he lived through the American Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I, Bell was a lifelong pacifist. During WWI, when many scientists were recruited into weapons research, Bell refused. He redirected his labs toward medical devices for injured soldiers, rehabilitation tools for veterans, sound detection devices to prevent shipwrecks, not to track enemies. He publicly condemned the use of science for destruction, writing in 1915, "Science should heal. If it kills, it betrays its own light." Bell's rejection of militarization earned him both praise and criticism. Some considered him naive. Others saw him as a visionary ahead of his time. Equality and inclusion. Bell's work with the deaf and disabled came from a deeply held belief in human dignity. He rejected charity that infantilized the disadvantaged. Instead, he championed education over pity, inclusion over isolation, empowerment over sympathy. He supported equal education for girls and women, minorities, and immigrants. He hired women in his labs and spoke at women's colleges. In a time when gender equality was rare in science, Bell stood as an ally. He once told his daughters, "The world needs not just women who listen, but women who speak." Spiritual reflections. Bell was not conventionally religious, but he held a reverence for what he called the great force of nature. He believed in a universal intelligence that created the laws of physics and biology, a moral order embedded in the universe, the idea that conscience was the human voice of natural law. He often walked alone in the forests of Nova Scotia, describing trees as silent philosophers and stars as the mathematics of heaven. He wrote, "Science is not the opposite of spirit. It is its most careful expression," on education and lifelong learning. Bell believed education should not end at the classroom door. He criticized rigid schooling systems and rote memorization. His educational philosophy included hands-on learning. Students should build, test, and explore. Curiosity over curriculum. He argued for self-directed inquiry, failure as a teacher. He saw every mistake as a seed of innovation. He personally funded scholarships, school buildings, and teacher training programs, especially in underserved communities. Bell advocated that every person, deaf or hearing, rich or poor, deserved the same opportunity to discover their voice, both literally and figuratively. Writings on the future. In the last decade of his life, Bell began writing a series of essays titled Thoughts on the Future, where he speculated on video communication. One day, we shall not only hear, but see across distance. Space travel, mankind will rise above Earth, and perhaps find peace among the stars. Global wireless networks. The Earth shall be circled in invisible threads, binding voice to voice. He also expressed fears that machines might replace thinking, that noise would overpower silence, that privacy could vanish in a world always connected. His writing reads like science fiction, but much of it has come to pass. A life of moral invention. Alexander Graham Bell's philosophy can be distilled into 4 guiding beliefs. Science should serve humanity. Education is liberation. Progress without conscience is regression. Every voice, however quiet, matters. In his quiet moments, Bell often quoted poets rather than scientists. He read Whitman, Tennyson, and Shakespeare. His lab was filled not just with wires and glass, but with books, nature sketches, and handwritten prayers for peace. Final thoughts. Inventing with intention. To Bell, invention was not just a technical act, it was an act of faith, hope, and responsibility. He saw the scientist as a servant of the future, accountable not just to shareholders or governments, but to humanity itself. He wrote shortly before his death in 1922, "Let no man call himself inventor, unless he has loved what he built and built it in love."